In Harlem, 1957, a sealed room of Mafia authority froze when one man made a joke about Bumpy Johnson's mother, a mistake measured in seconds. For 2 full minutes, no chair scraped, no hand reached for a gun, and seasoned killers realized the rules had changed without a word being spoken. There was no threat, no violence, no retaliation, only a silence so heavy it quietly stripped one man of his power. How did Bumpy Johnson destroy a mob boss without saying a single word? The room was chosen because nothing from it would remain. There were no windows, no staff, no written agenda, and no reason for anyone outside to ask what had happened inside. It was a private dining space above a Harlem restaurant cleared early and paid for in cash. Men arrived separately, never in pairs. Timing mattered more than secrecy, and eagerness was read as weakness. Anyone who arrived too early waited outside unseen. Coats were removed without assistance and seats were taken without instruction. No one asked where to sit and no one offered guidance. When the door closed, it did so once, and no one checked the lock. This was not a meeting meant to resolve conflict. It was meant to measure balance. Who still carried authority and who no longer needed to announce it. Bumpy Johnson sat slightly back from the table. He was not centered and not isolated, positioned where he could be seen without becoming the focus. Close enough to be acknowledged, far enough to avoid momentum. He did not initiate conversation and he did not interrupt when others spoke. His posture remained neutral, his expression unreadable. That restraint unsettled men accustomed to power being declared early. The discussion moved carefully, circling its subjects without naming them. Territory was referenced without streets and money was discussed without figures. Everyone spoke as if clarity itself were dangerous. Everyone in the room understood the boundaries. Business could be challenged and strategy could be criticized. Family could not. The remark arrived without warning. It was delivered, lightly framed as humor, and designed to pass without resistance. A comment aimed directly at Bumpy Johnson's mother. The words were not loud and they did not demand attention. They assumed it. The speaker smiled as if permission had already been granted. For a moment, nothing happened. Not because the room failed to understand what had occurred, but because everyone had. This was the point where violence usually introduced itself. Men waited for the shift. They waited for a chair to scrape back or for a voice to rise and claim the moment. They waited for Bumpy Johnson. He did nothing. He did not look at the speaker and he did not look at the table. His posture did not change and his hands remained still. There was no visible sign that the remark had landed. Seconds passed without structure. The silence was not dramatic, only unresolved, as if the next sound refused to arrive. The room did not know how to move forward. Someone inhaled sharply and stopped halfway through. Another man adjusted his cuff and froze before finishing the motion. Hands remained visible, deliberately empty. This was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of uncertainty, heavier because it offered no script. No one knew what role they were supposed to play next. Bumpy Johnson remained still. There was no tightening of the jaw and no narrowing of the eyes. Nothing that could be read as reaction. That absence carried weight. Without a response, the insult had nowhere to go. It could not escalate and it could not be corrected. The remark was suspended, unsupported, and exposed. The man who had spoken smiled again, weaker this time, searching for acknowledgement. None came. Power in rooms like this is usually confirmed by reaction, by how quickly a man forces attention back to himself and reasserts control. Bumpy Johnson denied the room that release. The silence stretched further. Not long enough to be counted, but long enough to be felt. Long enough to begin rearranging alignment. One by one, attention drifted away from the speaker. Not openly, and not in unison, but just enough to leave him isolated with his words. No one defended him, and no one joined him. The meeting resumed, but not cleanly. Conversation restarted in fragments, then steadied. Business reclaimed the space the silence had taken. No one addressed the remark directly. No one softened it, corrected it, or reframed it. It was neither forgiven nor challenged. The man who had spoken tried again later. His words were shorter, his tone restrained, and his confidence measured. He spoke as if testing whether the floor still held. Bumpy Johnson did not engage. He listened without expression and offered no resolution. The moment was allowed to remain unfinished. By then the balance had already shifted. The insult had not diminished Bumpy Johnson. It had exposed someone else. Men who moments earlier had nodded now avoided eye contact. Decisions moved past the speaker without pause. His presence became unnecessary. When the meeting ended, it did so without ceremony. There were no closing statements and no final gestures. Chairs moved back at different times. Coats were retrieved and pairs formed briefly before dissolving. Conversations started and stopped without explanation. Certain names were avoided. The man who had made the joke lingered near the back. He waited for acknowledgement, correction, or instruction. None came. No one told him he had crossed a line. No one needed to. The absence of response was the response. Bumpy Johnson left when he always did. Unaccompanied and unhurried, he did not look back. Nothing followed him out. Nothing happened that night. No calls were placed and no orders were given. The city slept undisturbed. Yet by morning, everyone who had been in that room understood the same thing. A boundary had been revealed, not enforced. And the man who crossed it had been left alone with the cost. In the underworld, violence draws attention. Silence draws conclusions, and some conclusions once reached cannot be reversed. In rooms like that, the rules were never written, but they were absolute. Insulting a man's family was not a social error or a lapse in judgment. It was a sentence waiting for execution. Everyone present understood the expected sequence. An insult was answered quickly to remove ambiguity and reassert order. Speed was not emotion, it was discipline. The response did not need to be loud or theatrical. It only needed to be clear enough that no one misread the balance of power. If clarity failed, the meeting ended and consequences arrived elsewhere. Men in the room had witnessed that pattern often enough to trust it. Family crossed meant retaliation, not debate. The only uncertainty was how soon it would happen. As the silence continued, preparation replaced conversation. Eyes began tracing exits, distances, and positions without anyone turning their head. The room shifted from dialogue to anticipation. No one believed the moment would dissolve on its own. Nothing like that ever did in their world. Waiting was never an ending, only a delay. The man who had spoken began to register the absence of response. His posture adjusted slightly, not aggressive, but guarded. He waited for the correction he assumed was inevitable. It did not arrive. Seconds passed without instruction, warning, or signal. Time stopped behaving like a pause and began acting like pressure. The silence no longer resembled calm. It became suspension that demanded endurance. Endurance in turn created strain. In other cities, hesitation would have invited escalation. Silence would have been read as weakness and exploited immediately. Here it produced something less predictable. The longer nothing happened, the heavier expectation became. Violence had been anticipated, and that readiness had nowhere to go. Men began to feel exposed by their own preparedness. No one attempted to reset the tone. There was no laughter, no side comment, no effort to soften what had landed. The moment was not diffused, it was preserved. Those present recalled the silence differently, but agreed on its effect. Some remembered seconds, others insisted it lasted longer. All agreed it altered the room. The absence of response forced recalculation. If nothing happened now, then something else was happening instead. Something quieter and harder to interrupt. Men realized they were watching a decision unfold without participation. It was not announced or explained, only enforced by waiting. Power was not asserted, it was demonstrated. The logic of the underworld demanded blood or apology. Neither appeared and neither was offered. That logic collapsed under its own certainty. Attention drifted away from the insult itself. It moved toward the space the silence occupied. Who would move first, and who would be left reacting? The man who had spoken became aware of his isolation. No one echoed his tone or reframed the remark. No one offered cover. He waited for intervention from someone else. someone of equal standing to normalize what had been said. No one did. The silence continued its work. It removed urgency from the insult and placed it squarely on the speaker. He became the unresolved element. What was expected to happen failed to arrive. No correction restored balance. The room was left to absorb the implication. Men began to understand that retaliation was no longer the point. The lack of it was. Whatever came next would not be immediate, and that made it worse. Conversation resumed carefully. Voices returned at a lower volume, stripped of confidence. Topics shifted, but attention remained fixed. The insult was no longer central, yet it stayed present. Not as an offense, but as a marker. A line crossed and left unanswered. This waiting imposed discipline. Words were chosen more carefully, tones flattened, proximity avoided. No one wanted to become the next unresolved problem. Time continued to pass, and still nothing happened. There was no signal, no warning, no visible preparation for violence. The expected outcome continued to refuse arrival. That refusal unsettled even those not directly involved. Certainty gave way to ambiguity. Ambiguity carried its own threat. By the time the meeting ended, tension had not disappeared. It had redistributed itself across the room. Men carried it with them when they left. What was expected to happen never appeared. In its place stood something less visible and more enduring. A silence that did not end when the room emptied. The meeting ended without incident. No voices were raised, no warnings issued, and no one was asked to stay behind. Men stood, collected their coats, and left in the same controlled manner they had arrived. There was no final exchange to mark closure. No handshake lingered long enough to signal alliance or fracture. The room emptied as if nothing unusual had occurred. That absence was deliberate. In that world, immediate reaction often drew attention, and attention created problems. Silence, by contrast, allowed consequences to form without fingerprints. No one was reprimanded that night. No calls were placed to correct behavior, and no intermediaries were dispatched to explain what had happened. The lack of follow-up appeared intentional. By the next morning, Harlem looked unchanged. Businesses opened on scheduled cars, followed familiar routes, and no unfamiliar faces lingered on corners. On the surface, the machinery of the neighborhood ran as it always had. Beneath that surface, communication began to thin. Phone calls that once received immediate responses were left unanswered. Messages were acknowledged late, if at all. At first, the delays seemed ordinary. Men assumed conflicts elsewhere, distractions, or timing issues. No one connected the silence to the meeting, at least not openly. Then patterns began to emerge. Invitations that had once arrived without prompting no longer came. Seats at familiar tables were filled by others. The changes were subtle enough to deny if challenged. No single moment confirmed exclusion. It was the accumulation that made it undeniable. Men who had once been consulted were no longer asked. Decisions were made elsewhere and relayed after the fact. Authority shifted without announcement. No one explained the adjustments. Explanations would have required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would have broken the silence. The silence was allowed to stand. Calls placed in confidence were not returned. Meetings requested were postponed indefinitely. Familiar intermediaries became suddenly unavailable. This absence created uncertainty. Uncertainty bred caution. Men began reassessing who they aligned with and who they avoided. Bumpy Johnson did not participate in these shifts publicly. He did not instruct others to withdraw, and he did not comment on changing dynamics. His restraint made the changes harder to trace. Those watching closely noticed the timing. The silence followed the meeting, not immediately, but steadily. The delay suggested intention rather than coincidence. No written record confirms the exchange, but patterns afterward suggest a shift. Relationships did not collapse overnight. They eroded quietly, directionally, and without resistance. Men accustomed to direct confrontation struggled to read the new landscape. There were no threats to respond to and no accusations to deny. The lack of clarity made reaction impossible. Attempts to reestablish contact were measured carefully. Messages were rewritten, tones softened, requests framed as routine. Most received no response. Others tried indirect routes. They asked mutual contacts for updates, for reassurance, for confirmation that nothing had changed. Answers were vague or non-existent. What unsettled them most was not rejection, but absence. Being told no would have allowed adjustment. Being ignored left no position to recalibrate from. Meetings continued elsewhere. Names were mentioned selectively. Some were omitted without explanation. The man who had spoken in the room began to feel the effects. His calls went unanswered longer than before. Invitations that once included him now arrived incomplete. He adjusted his approach. He spoke less, listened more, and waited for signals that never arrived. The silence did not correct itself. Others noticed and drew conclusions. Association carries risk when isolation begins. Men distanced themselves quietly, citing nothing. This distancing did not resemble punishment. It was not coordinated and did not require agreement. It spread because it made sense. Bumpy Johnson remained visible, but unchanged. He attended the same places, kept the same schedule, and offered no commentary. His steadiness contrasted with the instability around him. That contrast carried meaning. Power did not announce itself through action. It revealed itself through who no longer needed to act. As weeks passed, the silence settled into routine. What had once felt temporary began to feel structural. Relationships reorganized around it. Men learned to operate within the new reality. They adjusted expectations, redirected communication, and avoided asking questions with no answers. The silence trained behavior. No one publicly linked the changes to the meeting. Doing so would have required revisiting what had not been acknowledged. Silence remained the safer option. The absence of conflict confused outside observers. There were no visible signs of consolidation or takeover. Nothing appeared to justify the internal adjustments. Those inside understood better. Power had shifted not by removal, but by reallocation. Influence moved without resistance because it was never challenged. The man at the center of the change attempted to recover standing. He appeared where he was least expected, spoke when unnecessary, and waited when ignored. None of it altered the trajectory. Each attempt highlighted the gap further. Presence without acknowledgement carried no weight. Visibility without response became exposure. Others learned from this. They chose discretion over assertion. They spoke less and watched more. The silence had become instructive. It taught restraint without explanation. It rewarded those who adapted and isolated those who resisted. By the time the shift was unmistakable, it no longer needed confirmation. The silence had done its work. What followed felt inevitable. No violence marked the transition. No declaration formalized it. The absence itself became the marker. In that world, consequences often arrived loudly. This one arrived quietly and stayed. The silence did not end when conversations resumed. It followed men home. It shaped decisions before they were voiced. It defined who mattered without naming anyone. The meeting had ended without incident. The aftermath proved otherwise. Power had moved and no one had touched it. The isolation did not arrive as a declaration. It came as absence, quiet and cumulative, noticed only after it had already settled. No one announced a change, and no one needed to. The man who had spoken began to feel space forming around him. Not confrontation, not rejection, but distance that could not be argued with. Distance offered no appeal. He was not barred from rooms. He simply stopped being summoned to them. Meetings continued without him, and decisions reached completion before his name surfaced. At first, he assumed scheduling errors. Conflicts happened, calendars shifted, and people missed calls. He waited for correction that never came. Invitations that once arrived early no longer appeared. When they did, they came late or incomplete, stripped of context and urgency. He arrived informed but irrelevant. There were no explicit exclusions. No one told him he was no longer welcome. The absence of explanation made challenge impossible. Men began choosing different tables. Seats once held open were taken by others without discussion. Familiar arrangements dissolved without ceremony. He noticed conversations pause when he approached. Not abruptly, but just long enough to register. Topics resumed once he passed. Phone calls that once connected immediately now rang without answer. Messages were acknowledged hours later, sometimes days. The delays carried no apology. Attempts to ask directly were avoided. Questions were met with deflection humor or reassurance that nothing was wrong. Nothing, however, changed. Those around him began adjusting as well. Association brings risk when isolation becomes visible. Men recalculated proximity without stating why. The withdrawal was not coordinated. It did not require agreement or enforcement. According to men who later distanced themselves from the meeting, the withdrawal was immediate. No one claimed responsibility. Responsibility would have implied intent, and intent would have required explanation. Silence required neither. He attended public events to reassert presence. His appearance drew recognition but not engagement. Recognition without response offered no leverage. In private settings, his voice carried less weight. Suggestions were acknowledged politely and moved past. Decisions followed paths that excluded his input. The absence of resistance confused him. There was no accusation to deny and no threat to counter. He was left responding to nothing. Others watched and learned. The silence did not just isolate one man, it instructed the room. Power had shifted, and it was safest to adjust quietly. Bumpy Johnson did not intervene. He issued no guidance and made no visible effort to accelerate the separation. His non-involvement gave the withdrawal credibility. The isolation deepened through routine. Weeks passed without contact that once required none. Familiar intermediaries became unavailable without explanation. Attempts to re-enter conversations were cautious. He spoke, Les listened more, and waited for signals that never arrived. The silence offered no correction. Men who once sought his approval no longer did. Decisions reached finality elsewhere and arrived to him already settled. Influence dissipated without confrontation. This pattern spread across contexts. Business arrangements shifted subtly, routes changed, and priorities realigned. No single moment confirmed exclusion, but the pattern became unmistakable. He tried adjusting his tone. Confidence softened authority, muted urgency, restrained. The adjustments went unnoticed. The absence had already defined him. Presence without invitation carried no power. Visibility without response became exposure. Others avoided being seen with him. Not publicly, but enough to be noticed. Association began to feel unnecessary. The isolation did not produce anger. It produced uncertainty, which was worse. Uncertainty denied response. He searched for explanation in timing. He traced conversations backward, looking for moments he might have misread. The answers were always indirect. No one confirmed the connection to the meeting. No one denied it either. The lack of denial allowed the conclusion to stand. The withdrawal continued without interruption. Meetings occurred elsewhere and alliances reformed without announcement. Influence redistributed itself quietly. Bumpy Johnson remained unchanged. His presence carried the same weight it always had, requiring no reinforcement. Stability became its own signal. The contrast grew sharper over time. One man moved constantly without gaining ground. Another did nothing and remained central. That contrast required no explanation. Men understood it without discussion. Silence clarified what words would have complicated. By the time isolation became undeniable, it no longer mattered. The adjustment had already been absorbed into routine. The system had adapted. No retaliation marked the separation. No punishment formalized it. The absence itself completed the work. The man who had spoken learned too late that isolation required no enforcement. It only required consensus to withhold. Others took note and corrected course. They spoke, less watched more, and respected boundaries without needing reminders. The silence trained behavior. In the underworld, exclusion often arrives with force. Here it arrived with restraint. That restraint made it permanent. The step back was complete long before anyone named it. By the time it could be seen clearly, it could no longer be reversed. The silence had already closed the distance. What many expected never arrived. There was no attack, no warning delivered in private, and no visible preparation for violence. The absence unsettled observers more than any strike would have. In that world, retaliation served a purpose. It restored order, clarified boundaries, and closed the gap between insult and consequence. Without it, the sequence felt incomplete. Men waited for signs that were supposed to follow. A car lingering too long, a message passed quietly, a meeting canceled without explanation. None appeared. Days passed without disruption. Streets remained familiar routes unchanged, and faces on corners stayed the same. Harlem continued operating as if nothing had occurred. This continuity confused those watching closely. Violence would have provided explanation, even justification. Silence offered neither. Speculation began quietly. Some assumed restraint, others miscalculation, others weakness. None of those explanations held for long. Bumpy Johnson did nothing to correct the assumptions. He made no statement, issued no warning, and altered nothing in his routine. His steadiness denied speculation traction. No one close to him hinted at plans. No intermediaries carried messages meant to be overheard. The usual signs of preparation were absent. This lack of movement drew attention. Inaction began to look intentional rather than accidental. Time itself became the indicator. Men accustomed to reading signals struggled to interpret the quiet. Without threats, there was nothing to respond to. Without response, there was nothing to measure. The confusion spread beyond Harlem. Observers from outside the neighborhood expected escalation. Instead, they encountered continuity. What followed was not documented, only felt. There were no reports to confirm restraint and no records to explain delay. Only patterns emerged, steady and directional. Those patterns suggested that retaliation was not required. The consequence had already begun. Action would have added nothing. Bumpy Johnson's position did not change. He appeared where he always had spoke when necessary and declined when he chose. The absence of urgency worked in his favor. Others adjusted without instruction. They recalibrated alliances, moderated tone, and avoided unnecessary proximity. No one needed to be told. The lack of violence forced reevaluation. If nothing happened, then something else had already occurred. That realization carried weight. Men began asking quieter questions. Who benefits from delay and who suffers under uncertainty? The answers became clear without discussion. The man at the center of expectation felt it first. He waited for retaliation that would have at least acknowledged his relevance. Silence denied him even that. Without opposition, there was no conflict to win. Without conflict, there was no stage. His position diminished without resistance. Attempts to provoke response failed. Presence without reaction produced nothing. Silence refused engagement. Others learned from the pattern. Retaliation was no longer the measure of power. Restraint had replaced it. Bumpy Johnson's inaction became instructive. It demonstrated that force was optional when authority was uncontested. Nothing needed to be reclaimed. This unsettled those who believed dominance required demonstration. Here, demonstration would have weakened position by acknowledging challenge. Silence avoided that trap. Weeks passed without incident. Expectations adjusted. What had once felt temporary settled into permanence. The absence of violence removed urgency from discussion. Without crisis, there was nothing to negotiate. The situation stabilized on its own terms. Men stopped waiting for retaliation. Waiting implied uncertainty, and uncertainty was resolved. The lack of action became the conclusion. Those observing from a distance began to understand. Power had not been defended because it had not been threatened. The insult had failed to register as leverage. Bumpy Johnson's refusal to act reframed the entire exchange. It suggested that correction was unnecessary. The system had already responded. Others followed that lead. They stopped referencing the moment, stopped measuring response time, and stopped expecting reversal. The silence had answered everything. No meetings were called to explain the absence. No statements clarified intent. Clarification would have implied doubt. The city continued. Business proceeded, disputes resolved, and routines held. Nothing marked the change except its effect. Influence redistributed quietly. Decisions flowed toward stability and away from disruption. The process required no enforcement. The absence of retaliation confused those unfamiliar with the terrain. They searched for signs of weakness and found none. Stability replaced spectacle. Bumpy Johnson did not claim credit. He did not need to. The absence spoke clearly enough. Men who once expected escalation now adjusted their expectations. Power no longer required demonstration. It required patience. The silence trained behavior. It taught restraint without explanation. It punished excess without confrontation. By the time observers accepted that nothing would happen, everything had already happened. The consequence was complete without a single act. In the underworld, violence often announces transition. Here, transition arrived quietly and stayed. The lack of retaliation proved final. Nothing followed because nothing needed to. The system had already corrected itself. Silence had finished the work. The cost did not arrive all at once. It appeared gradually in ways that were easy to dismiss at first and impossible to deny later. Influence rarely disappears loudly. The man who had spoken began losing ground before he realized it. Decisions he once shaped moved forward without his input. Outcomes reached final form before his name surfaced. At first, the omissions seemed procedural. Meetings ran long, agendas shifted, and timing failed to align. No single exclusion felt intentional. Then patterns formed. Proposals he supported stalled without explanation. Initiatives he opposed advanced anyway. His objections were noted and then set aside. Responses came late, if at all. When they did, they carried no urgency. Men who once deferred now spoke past him. They did not challenge his authority directly. They simply stopped acknowledging it. This erosion carried no announcement. No one informed him of reduced standing. Authority dissolved through routine neglect. He noticed it in how decisions were framed. Language shifted from consultation to notification. He was told what had happened, not asked what should happen. Names began disappearing from conversations. His name was one of them, not removed deliberately, just omitted. In planning sessions, references shortened. "We'll handle it" replaced "we should ask." The adjustment sounded minor but carried weight. Later accounts differ on timing but not on outcome. Some recalled weeks, others months. All agreed the influence was gone before it was recognized. The absence of violence made the decline harder to contest. There was no enemy to confront and no event to reverse. Nothing had happened, and that was the problem. Attempts to reassert relevance failed quietly. He offered insight unprompted and received acknowledgement without adoption. Ideas entered the room and did not leave with traction. Others watched the process and learned from it. Influence was not seized, it was withdrawn. Power shifted because it was allowed to. The cost extended beyond meetings. Access narrowed. Information arrived filtered or incomplete. He found out about developments after they were settled, sometimes days later, sometimes longer. The delay stripped response of effect. Business arrangements adjusted subtly. Routes changed, intermediaries rotated, priorities reassigned. No document recorded the shift. He noticed it in tone. Conversations became formal, stripped of familiarity. Courtesy replaced confidence. Men no longer spoke freely around him. They chose words carefully, not out of fear, but out of disinterest. Disinterest carried finality. His presence stopped shaping outcomes. It merely occupied space. Presence without consequence offered no leverage. Attempts to identify the cause led nowhere. No one cited the meeting. No one acknowledged the connection. The lack of explanation deepened the cost. Without clarity, there was no correction. The silence closed off repair. Bumpy Johnson remained unchanged throughout. He did not gain new territory or issue directives. Stability itself became contrast. That contrast amplified the decline. One man lost influence through motion. Another retained it through stillness. The system rewarded predictability. Disruption became liability. The insult marked the speaker as unnecessary noise. Others adjusted behavior accordingly. They avoided excess measured speech and respected boundaries without being reminded. The cost of disrespect had been demonstrated. No one framed it as punishment. Punishment implies authority exercised openly. This was redistribution. Power moved away from instability and toward quiet control. It required no enforcement because it felt logical. The man tried repositioning himself. He aligned with new voices, adopted new tones, and waited for openings. None appeared. His name surfaced less often. When it did, it carried no urgency. Mention did not translate to influence. Over time, the omission became complete. He was no longer part of calculations that mattered. Decisions proceeded as if he were absent. The cost was not dramatic. It was cumulative. Each overlooked decision reduced standing further. There was no moment to appeal. Appeals require acknowledgement of error. Silence offered none. Those who benefited from the shift did not discuss it. Beneficiaries rarely do. They accepted the new order as natural. Later accounts differ on timing but not on outcome. Influence dissolved fully. Authority did not return. The absence of violence preserved stability. No disruption forced renegotiation. The system corrected itself without resistance. Bumpy Johnson did not comment. He did not need to. The cost had been absorbed into routine. By the time the decline was obvious, it was irreversible. Influence once lost without confrontation is rarely recovered. The silence had settled. In the underworld, power often ends with spectacle. Here it ended with omission. No gunshot marked the transition. The cost of disrespect proved permanent. It removed a man from relevance without removing him from the room. That was enough. Nothing announced the conclusion. Nothing needed to. Power had finished rearranging itself. Later observers searched for the turning point. They disagreed on dates and moments. They agreed on the result. The insult did not trigger violence. It triggered subtraction. The subtraction continued until nothing was left. By then the lesson was understood. Respect did not require enforcement. Silence was sufficient. The cost had been paid in full. Bumpy Johnson's power was never dependent on reaction. It rested on position memory and the understanding of limits shared by those around him. Action was optional when authority was already accepted. In that world, punishment was a tool, not a requirement. Tools were used only when something needed to be built or broken. In this case, neither was necessary. Johnson understood the value of restraint. He knew that responding to every provocation elevated the provocation itself. Silence, when timed, correctly denied that elevation. What mattered was not the insult, but the response it failed to produce. By refusing to act, Johnson removed the incident from the cycle of escalation. The moment was allowed to stand without reinforcement. Men accustomed to violence expected correction. They prepared for it because preparation was familiar. When it did not arrive, familiarity collapsed. This absence forced interpretation. Interpretation placed responsibility on the observer rather than the actor. Each man in the room reached his own conclusion. Those conclusions aligned without coordination. They aligned because the structure of power was already understood. Silence confirmed what violence would have complicated. Johnson did not need to punish because the system punished on its own. Networks recalibrated, access narrowed, and influence redistributed without instruction. Authority maintained itself. In environments governed by fear, fear must be renewed. Johnson governed by recognition. Recognition required no renewal. His stillness communicated finality. It suggested that the insult had not reached a level requiring response. That suggestion was more damaging than retaliation. Men learned quickly what the boundary was. They learned without being told. Limits that are understood without explanation endure longer. The meeting itself left no trace, its consequences did. No record captured the exchange, but behavior afterward documented its impact. Patterns replaced paperwork. Johnson's silence reframed the entire incident. It transformed an insult into a test the speaker failed alone. Failure without confrontation carried no appeal. This approach relied on patience. Patience allowed time to do the work. Violence usually rushed. Time exposed alignment. Others adjusted their behavior accordingly. They spoke with more care, listened longer, and avoided unnecessary displays. The lesson spread without attribution. Johnson did not claim authorship of the shift. Claiming would have required acknowledgement of challenge. He offered none. The effectiveness of silence depended on credibility. Johnson possessed that credibility through years of consistency. Consistency made silence believable. Inconsistent men cannot afford restraint. Their silence invites doubt. Johnson's silence invited compliance. Observers later struggled to explain why nothing happened. They searched for hidden deals or delayed responses. None surfaced. Later accounts differ on details but not on meaning. The absence of action was intentional. It reflected confidence rather than hesitation. Johnson understood that violence invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites intervention. Silence avoided both. By allowing the system to respond organically, he preserved stability. Stability protected his position better than force ever could. The neighborhood continued without disruption. Those who crossed the boundary paid without spectacle. Payment came in relevance rather than blood. Relevance once lost was rarely recovered. The lesson endured because it required no retelling. Men carried it forward in how they behaved. Stories followed later. Years afterward, the incident was referenced indirectly, not by date or location, but by outcome. That's what happens when you cross him, men would say. They did not describe violence, they described absence. Absence was the point. Johnson's authority was defined by what he did not need to do. He did not need to threaten, chase, or reclaim. His position made those unnecessary. The silence worked because it left others to enforce the boundary. Enforcement shared becomes enforcement sustained. No single hand held the line. This distribution of responsibility made reversal impossible. There was no order to rescind and no command to countermand. The system had already adjusted. Johnson's method required trust in structure. Structure had been built over time through predictable behavior. Predictability breeds confidence. Men trusted that Johnson would act when necessary. That trust made inaction meaningful. Silence signaled choice, not incapacity. The power of that choice echoed beyond the room. It influenced how disputes were handled and how insults were weighed. Silence became a reference point. Violence ends conversations. Silence extends them. Extension allowed consequences to deepen. The lesson was transmitted quietly. It appeared in caution, in measured speech, and in the avoidance of unnecessary tests. No one wanted to repeat the mistake. Johnson never articulated the lesson publicly. He did not need to. The example carried farther than instruction. The absence of retaliation became proof of authority. Only a man secure in position can afford not to respond. Insecurity always reacts. This understanding spread across the underworld. Men recalibrated expectations. Power no longer required display. The story survived because it resisted embellishment. There was no dramatic ending to distort. Only a quiet shift that proved lasting. Years later, when asked about moments that defined Johnson's reign, men pointed not to gunfights but to meetings like that one. Moments when nothing happened. Nothing had to happen because everything already had. The boundary was visible, the system aligned, and the lesson absorbed. Silence finished what violence never started. There was no file created that night. No report was written, no transcript filed, and no authority acknowledged that anything had occurred. The absence of record was not accidental, it was structural. Nothing happened in a way that could be proven. No sirens followed, no bodies marked the outcome, and no courtroom would ever examine the moment. On paper, the meeting ended cleanly. Yet one man left the room knowing something had closed behind him. He understood he had crossed a boundary that did not need to be defended. The realization arrived without warning and without appeal. The rest of the underworld absorbed a different lesson. They understood that limits still existed even when they were not enforced. Limits that require no enforcement endure the longest. In that room, no one died. No violence clarified the shift, and no retaliation announced a victor. The absence of blood made the conclusion harder to challenge. Power did not change hands through force. It redistributed itself, quietly flowing away from instability and toward stillness. What followed revealed which form of power lasts. Men adjusted without instruction. They recalibrated behavior, moderated speech, and avoided unnecessary tests. The system corrected itself without resistance. No one claimed responsibility for the outcome. Claiming would have required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would have weakened the lesson. Silence preserved it intact. Years later, accounts varied on details. Some disagreed on timing, others on location. None disagreed on the result. The meeting itself left no trace. Its consequences did. What remained was understanding. A shared recognition that authority does not always announce itself. Sometimes it reveals itself by refusing to respond. This was not restraint born of caution. It was confidence so complete that action became unnecessary. In that world, nothing is more dangerous. The file closes without resolution because resolution had already occurred. Not through punishment, but through subtraction. One man lost relevance and no one needed to say why. Silence carried the verdict. Time enforced it. And the underworld moved on, remembering not what happened, but what didn't. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe for cases history never documented cleanly. Some power is loud, but the most dangerous kind leaves no record and no noise. So here's the question. If you were in that room, would you have answered the insult or trusted silence to do the damage for you?